Marvel Snap's newest card, Mr. Fantastic First Steps, is blowing me away, not just with his raw power level, but with his versatility and the amount of different decks that he can go in. Mr. Steps is a 2/2 with an end of turn ability that gives a card in your hand either -1 cost or +2 power. And what I find so interesting about him is that you do not necessarily know which one he's going to give you, so deck building strategies have been coalescing around either or. For example, in a buff-oriented deck, you vastly prefer the +2 power. But if you're playing him in something like Living Tribunal, which is one of the things that I've seen him in, you are really hoping for the -1 cost. I think that Living Tribunal is a great example of a deck that actually actively wants the other half of this guy, because most of the way you deck build around a card that has this ability is to put cards that scale with buffs like Mr. Sinister and Brood and Sebastian Shaw into the deck with him, and then if you get the power on them, that's amazing. If you get the minus cost on them, you're still good, because you are a reactive mid-range deck in some ways as well, in addition to being a pure power deck. This is how base Mr. Fantastic deck building goes. What I've been really impressed with are the decks that are looking to use either half of him in a combo sense. And I already mentioned Living Tribunal, but Mr. Nimrod, I should say, that's what happens when you combine Mr. Fantastic and Nimrod, you get it, is a deck that I think is using him fairly well as well. There were already some awkward spots in the older build of that deck, i.e. Galacta. Now that she's +2, Mr. Fantastic can definitely replace her. Surge in that deck, again, if you get multiple discounters, that tends to make your ability to do ridiculous stuff a little bit stronger. So Mr. Fantastic has also been doing interesting stuff in Nimrod and Living Tribunal, in addition to just being what everyone expected him to be, which is a good 2-drop in an already powerful archetype. Now, that already powerful archetype is, of course, the buffs. This deck is legitimately just very, very strong, and in fact, I would call it good enough that I am considering buying a Fastos variant, which I do not own one of at all. And that is a testament to it on its own. Like, this is just straight up a deck that is clearly actively strong. But I think we should talk about the baseline here, because this is part of the reason for Mr. Fantastic's power. There is a deck out there that is already doing the stuff that Mr. Fantastic wants you to do, and is already a deck that cares not only about discounts, but about buffs on all of its cards. And I really want to speak to specifically the nexus of control tools that I think a lot of my viewers see in a lot of my decks, which is to say, Zabu and Surge as the enablers, Shang-Chi and Enchantress as the answers, and Galacta and Gwenpool as the good stat 4-drops that go with the Surge and go with the Zabu. This has been a constant throughout the last few months of Marvel Snap. And once Surge came out, she really, if you'll pardon the pun, supercharged it. Mr. Fantastic fits perfectly in anything that is already doing this, but he pushes you more towards being an actual buff deck. This is a deck that could very easily argue that it wants a Scarlet Spider. This is a deck that could very easily argue that it wants a Sebastian Shaw. I am playing what I would describe as the most minimal possible buff package while still being a reasonable buff deck, because just being a Galactic Gwenpool deck doesn't make you a buff deck at this point. But being a Galactic Gwenpool deck with both Mr. Sinister and Brood and America Chavez and Fastos, I think that does qualify you as a buff deck. But I don't want anyone to make the mistake of thinking that this is the only thing that Mr. Fantastic can do. Because yes, he goes in a deck like this, he makes a deck like this better. We talked about how obviously he's good with the buffers, but I want to point out something very specific about discounting cards, and it's that the more cards you discount, the better your Shang-Chi based game plan is, because it means you can play more stuff alongside a Shang-Chi on the final turn of the game. And I think that is the other half of Mr. Fantastic that is being used in this deck very well. You might look at this and say, we're always wanting to hit the buff, and we have a lot of things that scale very well with the buff, but we also have effectively a way to scale with the negative cost, because it allows us to play other stuff alongside a Shang or an Enchantress in the matchups where that's relevant. I think that that is a good example of the sort of more subtle nature of Mr. Fantastic's negative cost compared to the more obvious and powerful nature of his +2 power. When it comes to Living Tribunal, there is really only one player that I truly trust, and his name is, paradoxically, Hella Enjoyer. Now, Hella Enjoyer was responsible for the original good build of Living Tribunal. People were messing around with it before, but what he brought to the deck was not just consistency, but confusion. This deck is a deck that leverages the discount very well. A deck that really cares about getting specific cards out early and about using them to do powerful things. It wants to be more than the sum of its parts, and it wants to play as many of those parts as possible. So this is a deck that is very much looking for the minus cost rather than the plus power. And the reason it's able to do that is because now we have 3 2-drops. All of them have the ability to accelerate us. Jenny Kale accelerates us. Mr. Fantastic can accelerate us. Surge can accelerate us. And what that allows this deck to do, those 2-drops effectively provide the lubricant to grease the wheels of the engine that is this deck. I realize if you're actually a car guy, that analogy doesn't make sense. I am not a car guy. I'm a card guy. So, what this deck is effectively trying to do is to most efficiently and powerfully access the endgame it has available to it. Living Tribunal's endgame is stronger than many other things in the current era of Marvel Snap. The downsides of Living Tribunal's endgame are, A, it can be interacted with fairly profitably a lot of the time, thanks to cards like Enchantress and occasionally Red Guardian, and B, Living Tribunal's endgame is not something it can access in every game. So having something that allows you to access more energy, having something that allows you to have more potential to get to your actual end game is a very powerful thing. And this is a deck that is doing something that not a lot of decks are prepared for. I've actually seen more people cutting Enchantress from stuff to fit in these sort of Mr. Fantastic-centric points packages, and that leaves this deck in a very good spot. Since the nerf to Red Guardian, he's been in far fewer decks as well. That also leaves this deck in a very good spot. So when I look at a deck that is looking to scale with the negative cost, yes, some Shang decks sort of do that by accident, but this is a deck that really wants the negative cost as much as it can possibly get it, and will use that negative cost to run you over with other cards. This is Mr. Fantastic doing his best impression of a support card. Not a card that your game plan is built around, just a card that helps you do what you already wanted to do. This build from Heart of the Cards is built around stacking buffs on good buff targets. You'll notice Mr. Fantastic here is joined by Herbie. One of the things that has always defined Surfer builds to me is not the 3-drops you choose to put in them, but the suite of 2-drops you choose to put in them. And this deck has a lot of very powerful 2s. We are finally back to 3 legitimately strong 2s in Surfer, which means that we can very often be expecting to do very reasonably powerful things. Now, there are good hits in here, and by good hits, I mean great hits for both sides of Mr. Fantastic. As we know, Surfer is a deck that very often wants to have a minus cost 3 in order to play a 3 and a 3 on turn 5. That's obviously one function Mr. Fantastic serves. But as a deck that also has the card Captain Carter in it, as a deck that also has the card Brood in it, it is a deck that is very easily able to benefit from +2 as well. Even +2s on your Herbie, that's a very valuable thing too. So you have multiple things that are good at carrying buffs without hyper investing in those multiple things that are good at carrying buffs. This is a very classic Surfer deck, and I think that it speaks to the power of the shell that it really only took 2s to bring it back to prominence, because all the 3s and the 1/4 are the stuff we already had. I also want to specifically highlight Makari, because this is something I think we might be seeing a little bit more of, maybe not a lot more of, but it is an interaction that comes up. She gets herself out of the hand, which means that you are very often more easily able to target Mr. Fantastic buffs onto the stuff you actually want. Same goes for Gwenpool. Makari and Gwenpool are a pretty good combination, in large part because of that. Similarly, on the final turn, if for some reason you're forced to play Gwenpool and you have a Makari in your hand, that is yet another piece of upside that the card has. I think that Makari is a very solid card here, but it definitely has some additional impacts when you have a few really good targets for your stuff and then a couple of not so good targets for your stuff. That is definitely a space where Makari gets to shine. I am really impressed with whoever put this together, and I don't know who it was, but I really like the direction they're taking the Nimrod deck. The Nimrod deck has sort of languished for obvious reasons since I posted my day one build. Every time I tried a build that wasn't that, I was like, oh, I think they made it worse. This is a deck where I think they might have legitimately improved it. Nimrod and Elixir Black Panther are our plans. Full stop. That's what we do. We Nimrod against decks that have Shang-Chi. We Elixir Panther against decks that don't. And Mr. Fantastic is here to do what he's doing in the Living Tribunal decks, which is grease the wheels. This card is doing an impression of both Surge and the old Galacta that was in here. Now, you'll also notice an Echo in here. I like that. It shuts down Cosmo. I think that's a cool little thing to have in here. I don't know if she's required. And I think in large part, what I want to speak to here is to say, I know what the required cards are in these decks, and it's not necessarily going to be Echo. So I'll say that much. I'm trying to do a better job of getting those in while I can. So Echo, probably not a required piece of what this deck is doing, but unfortunately, I don't really think that information is going to be useful to anyone looking to budgetize this deck, because Kid Omega is a required piece of what this deck is doing. So, I mean, let's be real about what's going on here. All of that is to say, I think that this represents a potential legitimate improvement, an evolutionary leap in the Kid Omega deck's refinement, and once Kid Omega actually hits snap packs, I would expect this to be something similar to what people are going to look to as a starting point. I feel like this is a meaningful improvement in the curve of the deck, and as long as you are doing one of your combos, you should be in a decent spot. I am a little bit sad to lose out on the Arnim Zola Panther. I think that if I were to replace Echo, it would be to get Zola back in the deck. Last up is Mr. Evo. I believe this build was put together by Smiles, and I think it is a very reasonable way to try to play High Evolutionary. Unfortunately, you have the downside of trying to be a High Evolutionary deck. Now, that's not to say that this deck is actively terrible or anything like that, but I do think that it gets overshadowed once other decks start to refine itself. One of the major advantages that decks like this have is that they're already more or less pre-built. You're taking a pre-built shell and you're putting a new card in it, and you're like, okay, this improves my pre-built shell, and I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to go beat up on decks that are unrefined. The reason I think that's not going to happen for this deck is because basically every other deck that Mr. Fantastic is going in is also a pre-built shell. This is not a world where this card is going into unrefined deck lists and people are experimenting. This is not Dormammu. This is not Morgan Le Fay. It's not doing that. This is a card that is going in decks that are already very, very refined, and so the advantage that a deck like this normally has in early metagames of knowing that you're playing roughly the correct build while your opponents probably aren't is sort of mitigated, I think. Now, other downside here is I sort of fundamentally will never accept a Magic deck as actually being good enough. And I don't mean that to say like she's terrible or anything, just I don't think it's possible for a Magic deck to ever realistically be the best deck in the game, especially if that Magic deck is not doing some other things that don't rely on Magic. And I feel like this deck is very much a Magic deck. And the reason for that is largely like, if you play this card, you are asking to get rug pulled some percentage of the time. It can never be the best deck in the game because the counterplay to it is so overpoweringly strong, you just instantly lose cubes on 50-50s randomly. There's just no way of actually knowing. There's a ton of Merlins giving people free ability to get rid of Limbos, things like that. To me, Magic sort of hard caps any deck that it's in as only ever being able to be so good for so long because the counterplay to locations is so insanely powerful. All of that is to say, I think this is a reasonable approach. I like that there's a fantastic card deck out there that is trying to do some end of turn stuff, but I do not expect this deck to end up reaching that 50% win rate that would make it a contender to actually make it like further in the metagame. I think this is going to be a very sort of flat deck. You're going to win some games, you're going to lose some games. It's going to be in roughly equal amounts. This deck is probably not going to carry you. You are going to have to carry it by playing smart. And so that is an example of where this card can fit and why I think that typical approaches to this card do not make so much sense because the decks it's going in are already so powerful in terms of both floor and ceiling and interaction. All right, y'all, thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one. Have a wonderful day. Thanks.